Hi guys, welcome to Coturnix Corner. So we recently had Michael Rose from Southwest Game Birds on the Coturnix Corner Live Show, and he talked about some of the common myths currently being circulated about Coturnix. I thought that was a really good show. So what we did was I took that show and I cut out just the section of where Michael was talking about the myths and put it into its own show. That way you don't have to sit and watch the entire live stream just to get the gist of these myths. So I'm going to go ahead. We're going to turn it over to Michael and let him talk a little bit about these myths, and we'll see you on the other end of the show. All right. So the first category or topic, these are all incubation myths, and the first myth is the float test will tell you if an egg is good or not.
So this is a common myth. It's a common practice that you just put all of your eggs in water and you see which ones sink and which ones float. So there's an ounce of truth to this in that as an egg ages, water content will evaporate out of the egg, so there's more air and less dense material inside the egg. So an old egg will float, and there's a correlation between old eggs and rotten eggs. Rotten eggs will also produce a lot of gas, and that will work its way out of the egg because the shell is porous. So it's true that a rotten egg will float. The problem is if you're using this as a test to see which eggs are good or bad during incubation, by the time you're done incubating quail eggs, they should all float. So enough water will evaporate out of the egg to give that egg an air cell big enough for the quail to breathe long enough to hatch. And because quail eggs are so small, it's actually a larger percentage of the egg. So you don't want to rely on the float test, especially if you're using it in place of candling to pull out bad eggs. It's just not a good method. However, the eggs that sink are going to be your fresher eggs, so there's an ounce of truth to the myth, and that's kind of where it ends.
The next one on the list is mist your eggs with gold Listerine before incubation to get a better hatch rate.
Yeah, so this was trending a year or two ago. I have no idea why it was the gold Listerine that everyone was going crazy about, but for some reason that just took off. Quail eggs don't really need to be sanitized for a good hatch rate, especially in a home incubation setting. Your incubator isn't sterile. So in a large commercial hatchery, they do wash the eggs to get slightly better hatch rates. But we're really talking about going from like a 91% hatch rate to a 92.5% hatch rate or something like that. When you're dealing with 75, 80% hatch rates in a home setting, you don't really need to wash the eggs. If anything, it will actually put them at risk of contamination if you're putting them into a non-sterilized incubator afterward. So gold Listerine doesn't have enough alcohol content to kill bacteria. It's just really not a good option for washing eggs, and there's no scientific backing behind that one. So that one's just a flat out myth.
Okay. Also, I've heard some people would spray their eggs with hydrogen peroxide. Same thing, or?
No, actually, there is some scientific data behind that.
Okay.
But again, to take advantage of those benefits, you have to have a sterile incubator. So hydrogen peroxide, that's one of the things that they'll use in the commercial hatcheries. There's a few other detergents that are used, but again, when we're talking about quail in a backyard setting, if you're incubating less than a few thousand eggs, most people less than 100, there's no need for this at all. Just set aside any eggs that are overly soiled and incubate the ones that look clean. They're most likely going to be just fine.
Okay, cool. Okay, next one on the list says if your eggs aren't hatching, raise the humidity to soften the shell.
We see this one all the time. You do need to raise the humidity compared to the incubation humidity for the best hatch rate, but the humidity doesn't actually soften the shell. What the humidity does is it softens the membrane under the eggshell. The shell is made of calcium carbonate, so no matter how much water, you could set an egg in water for a month and it's never going to soften that shell. It's still going to crack if you hit it against something. So what quail need is an ideal humidity range in order to hatch. And if you have them in that range, you want to keep them there. They might just need a little bit more time to hatch, but if you raise the humidity above that ideal range, what happens to that eggshell membrane is it actually becomes sticky and gummy. So the quail won't have any problem tearing through the membrane, which is the purpose of adding humidity at the end of incubation. But once they do tear through it, it's just going to stick to their face, and they're not going to be able to breathe or get away from it. So we always recommend just keep them in the ideal humidity range and leave them there and be patient. If they're a strong chick and they're meant to hatch, then they'll hatch for you.
Okay. What are the ideal ranges?
So it depends a little bit on your altitude. At low altitude, quail are a desert bird, and to hatch, you need about 50-55% humidity. In a low altitude setting, you don't want to go above about 65%. We start to see customers reporting issues with high humidity when it hits about 70%. Now, if you're at high altitude, if you're in Breckenridge, Colorado, trying to hatch these things at 9,000 feet, I think the range, when you're above 7,000 feet, you should adjust humidity to be slightly higher. And I'll be completely honest, I'm not actually sure what the ideal range is. So it may take some trial and error, but it wouldn't surprise me if that ideal range is about 65 to 75% at really high elevation. And the reason for that is the air is less dense, and you need the same number of water particles hitting that shell membrane so that the chick can tear through it.
Good. Sounds good. Okay, and the last one under this category is use a Gobi thermometer to calibrate your incubator.
Yeah, we get a lot of complaints about people using Gobi thermometers. Actually, if I see an email coming in asking about the hatching process and they even mention the word Gobi, I know kind of where that's headed. Gobi makes interesting products. They're really techy. They connect to your phone. They track data. So there's some useful things about them, but from what our customers have reported to us, they're difficult to calibrate. They don't necessarily hold calibration well. And if you have a good incubator that comes pre-calibrated from a company with a good reputation like Barodo, Brinzia, Hatching Time, GQF, they're going to calibrate that machine before they send it out, and it's probably more accurate than your Gobi. So definitely don't use a Gobi to calibrate your incubator. We recommend using either a NIST thermometer, and that's a thermometer calibrated by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or you can get an incubator thermometer from GQF or Brinzia for about $20. That's a really affordable way to do it. And if you're on a really big budget, you can take a liquid thermometer and calibrate yourself in ice water. And that will usually get you a much better result than trusting something right out of the box like Gobi. What Gobi's great for is kind of monitoring changes in your incubator. You can tell if you lose power and it'll send you an alarm. So they're useful database, but definitely don't use them for calibrating your incubator.
Okay. What about the Mercury thermometers? Are they? I was always told that they're pretty accurate. Is that true, or don't you think so?
Yeah, it's actually hard to get your hands on a Mercury thermometer these days. But the liquid thermometers with the red liquid, I don't know exactly what's in them. Those are usually pretty good. They might not come calibrated perfectly. You get one that's like $2 from Walmart, but they're going to be consistent. So what you can do is you can submerge it in ice water, wait a few minutes, put a little mark on it, and that's 32 degrees. And then you can see, is it off by a degree? Is it off by 2 degrees? And you can kind of guess. Then at incubation temperature, it's going to be off by the same amount, and use it like that.
Okay. Rebecca commented that there's a lot of background noise going on. Rebecca, that's my air conditioner, and there's nothing I can do about that right now because it's so hot down here. I can't sit in this room without AC on. Sorry about that. Okay, our next category is sales tactics and myths. And the first myth is Goliath, colossal, Cairo whites, giant white quail are the largest of the Coturnix.
So all of these categories or descriptors are big red flags that are very commonly used by scammers. So if you see any of these words used when people are advertising their quail, just be really cautious. There's a little bit of evidence behind some of these that they have some potential. I know, for example, giant whites, there's some pretty convincing videos out of Russia of some really impressive bloodlines. But same thing, there's some interesting stories about, so Zero Whites is actually a trade name from the infamous scammer Hatch Poultry. But it was based on the Cairo whites from Egypt, which are a really impressive bloodline. I'm not aware of them being for sale. So these are just very common sales tactic to say, oh, Goliath quail are bigger than jumbo quail. But the term Goliath quail actually originated in Australia from a scammer down there who was selling jumbo quail that were a little overweight, taking pictures of them and then feeding them too much protein to pump up the egg size, and people ended up with normal jumbo quail when it was all said and done. So a lot of people are trying to push the boundaries of how big quail can get. I think that's great. There's probably a lot of potential with where the birds can go, but just be really careful when you're buying from anybody using any of these terms.
Okay. Crosses produce the largest quail.
So this is another one. It's rooted in truth. In the chicken industry, you have Cornish cross birds, which are phenomenal meat birds. They took about, I think, 100 years to develop. And what's interesting is if you take those birds from a hatchery, you raise them, they all produce amazing big meat birds. Breed them another generation, and it completely falls apart. Okay. So this is a common misconception, is that crosses produce hybrid vigor, and that's true, they can, but it only lasts one generation. So if somebody takes birds from one breeder and birds from another breeder and crosses them and has all these amazing pictures of these great birds showing hybrid vigor, and they're selling hatching eggs from those birds, it's not a guarantee that you're going to get the same thing. There's actually almost a guarantee that you won't, because you'll be getting the F2 generation where that hybrid vigor falls apart, and then you get all kinds of different results. So yeah, not a good idea to buy cross birds.
Okay. Now this is one I was surprised to see in there. Southwest Game Birds has the best jumbo wilds and Texas A&Ms.
So we see comments like this once in a while. We get a lot of questions. Are ours the best? And I put this in here because Southwest Game Birds doesn't sell jumbo wilds or Texas A&Ms. Those are trade names. Mm-hmm. So the variety that those typically refer to are jumbo Pharaoh or jumbo browns and jumbo white birds. So white, brown, and Pharaoh would be the plumage variety, jumbo being the size, and then jumbo wilds, it's a trade name from MyShare Farms.
Yes.
Technam, same thing. That was bloodline developed by the Texas A&M University. So as far as I know, no one's really been maintaining that. If they have, it's been 10 plus years since Dr. Thornberry's worked with them. And so are they really Texas A&Ms anymore, or are they really the credit of whatever breeder maintained them since then? Because a bloodline can change a lot in a very short amount of time.
Okay. Next one is a good breeder will stand behind their eggs and guarantee your hatch rate.
Yeah, I guess that means I'm not a good breeder. There's no real way, especially with shipped eggs, for a breeder to guarantee your hatch rate. What a hatch rate guarantee refers to is more a money-back satisfaction guarantee. So what is important to realize when you buy shipped eggs, or even any eggs, is there are a lot of variables that can affect that hatch rate, and most of them have nothing to do with the breeder. So if you see something like a hatch rate guarantee, the industry average is about 50%, so you see a lot of breeders guaranteeing a 50% hatch rate. What that just means is it's a satisfaction guarantee. If you don't get 50%, they'll do something about it. But I would encourage you to ask them what that something is. Is it a partial refund? Is it a replacement? Is it a full replacement? Is it a 50% replacement? Most breeders will not order free of charge if you get a 49% hatch rate, because that's pretty normal. So just it's a sales tactic. It's not necessarily a myth, but just it's semantics and wording.
Okay. I don't know if you notice on your end, Michael, we're getting a little bit of, not so much lag, but it's like you drop out for a second and then it comes right back. So far, it's not too bad.
Okay.
So far, it's not too bad, and I don't know if it's your Wi-Fi doing it or not. But okay, next category is food and diet myths. And the first one is feeding raw egg whites. Feeding raw egg whites to your dog is unhealthy for them.
So this actually started from a laboratory experiment on rats, I believe. where they were fed egg white protein as their primary protein source, and they all developed biotin deficiencies. They started losing their hair, going neurotic, losing muscle tone. Biotin is very important, but if you eat a raw egg, or if your dog eats a raw egg, there's no evidence that that will give them a biotin deficiency. So what's happening is there's something called avidin in the egg white, and if you eat just the egg white and you eat enough of it, you can develop a biotin deficiency because avidin binds to biotin, and then your body can't absorb it. The egg yolk has a really good amount of biotin, so typically if you feed the entire egg, there's no issue. So what you need to do is watch out if your dog's prone to a biotin deficiency. Don't feed them large amounts of just egg white, but just for perspective, an average 50-pound dog would have to eat 100 quail egg whites per day to develop a biotin deficiency. And if you've got time to separate the yolk out to make sure that they're only eating the egg white, and you're feeding that much egg white to your dog, I've never heard of anyone doing that. So It's really not something you have to worry about. And it's certainly not going to give them a biotin deficiency, at least not that I've ever heard of. And we have a lot of customers who feed their dogs quail eggs.
Right. I do mine too. Okay, next one is quail eggs don't have cholesterol.
Yeah, quail eggs actually have a lot of cholesterol, more so than chicken eggs on a pound-per-pound basis. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily bad. Quail eggs have healthy fats and lipids, and the cholesterol in the actual egg is more HDL than LDL. But all that's going to do is give you the building blocks to make cholesterol in your body. So dietary cholesterol does not equal the cholesterol in your body. So there's a study on chicken eggs that showed eggs eaten in moderation actually improved cholesterol overall compared to a control group. There's no study on quail eggs, but based on the fact, and I would argue quail eggs are just as healthy, if not more so. So I don't think that you really have to worry about it making your cholesterol go off the charts, but the actual eggs themselves do contain a lot of cholesterol.
Okay. Next one, quail eggs can't carry salmonella. I've heard that one several times.
Yeah, we hear this one all the time. Typically, the argument that is made is that quail are either immune to salmonella or they have a higher body temperature than chickens, and because their body temperature is around 104 degrees, salmonella can't survive in their body, so the eggs are safe to eat raw. There's not very many reported cases of quail eggs carrying salmonella or people getting sick from it, but salmonella can actually survive at around 113 degrees, which is much warmer than your quail's body. So what we've seen is in other countries where quail eggs are more common, the rate of salmonella poisoning is right about on par with chicken eggs. Okay. So they can contain salmonella. It's important to be careful. And there's really not a big difference between quail eggs and chicken eggs when it comes to salmonella risk.
Okay, cool. That's good to know. Let's see. Pickled quail eggs are shelf stable.
This one might get me in trouble. There's a lot of people that like their pickled quail eggs, myself included. So you see them in the store. They're on the shelf. The big picklers do it. What's the big deal? Why can't I? The main concern is a bacteria called Clostridium botulinum produces a neurotoxin that leads to a disease called botulism. And there's strong evidence, proof I would argue, that can grow in the egg. And it is a risk. It's a very rare thing, but if it happens to get in the egg, it's very deadly. So my advice, refrigerate your quail eggs just because there's a small chance that can get in there and it's very dangerous. Botulism takes about 2 hours to produce a lethal dose of toxin. So you have to kill the bacteria, all of it, within 2 hours. There's a few ways to do that. You can kill it with acid, and people sometimes think that the brine in the pickling process will kill the botulism. It will, but it doesn't penetrate the egg fast enough. So if you've ever pickled quail eggs with beet juice, you know it takes about 2 weeks for that to work its way through the egg white, right, and it never even works its way through the yolk. So if the botulism is in there, it's got way more than 2 hours to do damage. The next way that you can kill it is with temperature. This is how the commercial canneries do it. So they raise the temperature to about 270 degrees Fahrenheit, that will kill botulism instantly. They use superheated steam to get it up to that temperature, and then they use vacuum to get it down really, really quickly so it doesn't destroy the actual physical egg. We can't do that at home with home cannery. We can only get up to about 240, 250 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
At those temperatures, you have to let it sit for about 3 minutes to kill the botulism. And within 3 minutes, your eggs are going to turn to mush, so you're not going to have pickled quail eggs anymore. So there's really no realistic way to make sure that you're 100% safe other than refrigerating the eggs after you make them. So refrigerate the eggs. Don't be the person that accidentally kills 10 people at your church picnic sharing the pickled quail eggs. Yeah. It hasn't happened yet, but it's like a ticking time bomb. If we keep eating unsafe foods, eventually it could happen.
Sure. I see somebody post, what about pressure canning?
Yeah, so that's how the commercial picklers do it. They use high pressure, superheated steam, and vacuum. If you're pressure canning at home, it's nowhere near the amount of pressure that you need in order to get it up to temperature and down again before you destroy the egg.
Okay. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about husbandry myths. And then the first one is keeping quail in a natural enclosure is better than those tiny cages. I hear that one all the time too.
Yeah. If you're not familiar with quail and you've never raised them before, it makes sense. The cages look tiny. It's abuse. It's so horrible. But look at that big aviary and how pretty it is, and those happy little birds. First of all, there's nothing natural about an aviary either. You're keeping the birds in captivity, so nothing wrong with that. They're just a caged quail, but they're a very small bird, and from my experience, they're just as happy in small close quarters as they are in a big aviary, provided they have everything that they need. Mm-hmm. So if you got them in a cage and you're giving them food, water, nutrients, mental stimuli, their plumage is in good condition, the temperature's right, they're not fighting with each other, you can have very happy, healthy quail that way. There's pros and cons to keeping them on the ground in an aviary. I think that can be done responsibly as well. There's some more risks to things like pathogens in the soil and whatnot. Square footage density, sometimes it can be a little trickier to manage in a cage, but there's just pros and cons to both. The species is domesticated. They do very well in an indoor setting. And the idea when you're keeping quail, just keep them safe, keep them healthy. Much better to have a safe, healthy quail, regardless of the environment, than a quail that's miserable. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next one is only male quail are aggressive.
Yeah, raise them for a little while, and you'll see this one's not true at all.
Yep.
Male quail are more often aggressive. They're establishing the pecking order. They're leading the flock generally, but particularly in a cage or a pen with no males, females will establish their own pecking order, and you'll do it by hand. Oftentimes, once a hen discovers that she's in charge, there's no stopping her, and she'll be much more aggressive than any male in your flock. So what typically happens is male quail, while certain bloodlines can be a little rowdy, and they can draw blood from breeding activities or from fighting and squabbling, it's much more common for a female alpha hen to actually kill another bird. So yeah, the females can definitely be aggressive too.
Yep, I've seen that. Okay, next one is if a quail is being picked on by an aggressive male, you should remove it until it recovers and then put it back.
So this one's sort of rooted in truth. If a quail is getting injured and there's blood and everyone's picking on him, he may be going in a very bad direction very quickly, and so there may be a necessity to remove him. But if he's just being picked on, they're working out their dominance hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So quail don't think the same way people do necessarily. There's dominance hierarchies everywhere, but quail are very simple. They want to establish their hierarchy, and then they're kind of settled. If you disturb that process, you may do more harm than good. And the last part of this myth is the worst part, which is as soon as the quail recovers, then just put him back. That's a recipe for disaster. As soon as you put that quail back, that's when the trouble usually begins. So there's a trick to reintroducing quail. You usually manipulate light and dark cycles. So you introduce them at night, or you turn the lights off, and you take the more dominant quail out, but the less dominant quail establish their territory, put the more dominant quail back in, let them swallow it out. It's usually a lot less violent that way. So you definitely don't want to just take them out and put them back in willy-nilly.
Yeah. I do a lot of, not a lot, but a few of my cages I rotate males to different coveys of hens, and I have to introduce the male at night because sometimes I'll put them in the daytime, and the hens, like you say, they've got their own little pecking order, and they don't want that male in there, so I agree.
Yep.
Next one is, you need a male to be present for females to lay eggs.
Yeah, this is a common misconception. It's actually light that stimulates a quail to lay eggs. So as long as she has the nutrients that she needs, particularly calcium, she's old enough, she's sexually mature, give her enough light, she's going to start laying eggs for you. So stress is another one. Stress will stop a hen from laying eggs. So if she feels safe, she's old enough, she's got all the nutrients she needs, and she's not stressed, give her some light and she'll lay eggs. You don't need a male.
Okay. Okay, the next category is on genetics. And the first one is, pointy eggs are male, round eggs are female, and big eggs make the biggest birds.
So figuring out the sex of the bird based on the egg shape, we've seen is correct about 50% of the time. That's the old joke. That's completely random. The egg shape has nothing to do with which gametes the female gave to that offspring. So there's a 50-50 chance the hen is going to pass on the Z chromosome, 50-50 chance she's going to pass on the W chromosome, and then that determines the sex of the bird. So you unfortunately can't identify them by the egg shape, and then you can't identify much from the egg at all, actually. Mm-hmm. So the egg size technically has a small correlation with the size of the bird, because bigger birds lay big eggs, but there's much more variety in egg size from the beginning of a hen's lay life to the end of it. They'll typically lay bigger eggs when they're 10 months old than they will when they're 2 months old. So those all have the exact same genetics, and that's only about half of the bird's genetics. The other half come from the male. So he will actually also determine the bird's size, and it's a whole lot more complex than just looking at the egg.
Yep. Okay, where are we at here? Quail can change their sex. I've never heard that one.
This one's not as common. I think it's more common. But again, I've seen it in ducks as well. There's some anomalies where typically what happens is, and I'm not talking about in a lab where people are manipulating the genome, but in a normal backyard setting, you put a hen in a cage, you forget about her for a few months, and you go back and look, and suddenly there's a male in that cage. What happened? Normally what happened is the hen has some type of damage in her ovary. So quail don't use both ovaries, they use their left ovary typically. So they only have to get damage in one ovary, and suddenly they're not producing the estrogen that they're typically producing to exhibit female plumage, female traits. So they'll get some of the male traits, and they'll look like a male. They may try to act like a male, but their genetics is still the same. They still have the female quail genetics.
Cool. Okay, this is a good one. Nothing can breed 100% true. Any bird can carry any recessive mutation.
Yeah, this is a common misconception because there's tons of mutations. They can hide. They seem to pop out of nowhere. But it's not true that any bird can carry any recessive mutation. The bird either has it or it doesn't, and it has to get it from its parents. Spontaneous mutation generation is very, very rare. Each time a quail reproduces, there's about 22,000 genes, and it'll have about 3 mutations. But the odds of one of those being a plumage mutation, we only know about 20 or 30 plumage mutations from thousands of years of breeding quail. So very, very rare that there can be a spontaneous mutation. It can happen, but it's not going to be the same mutation that your friend over in the next state over has. So if the root mutation pops out, that's because one of your birds had it. But you can definitely breed a line to lay true without that mutation by proper breeding, proper selection, and understanding what goes into your birds and what they'll pass on to their offspring.
Okay. This one I have heard. Quail can become egg-bound if their plumage breeds true.
Yeah, I think this is part of what inspired you to do this live stream, right?
Yes, it was.
You heard someone say this. Uh, there's there's really no correlation between a bird becoming egg-bound and their plumage. The misconception here is that there's an inference that birds whose plumage breed true must be inbred and unhealthy in order to get that result.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, there's lots of ways that you can get a bird to breed true that don't require subpar breeding. And you can even take two completely unrelated birds if you understand their underlying plumage genetics, and you can predict what type of plumage their offspring will produce. Why birds most likely become egg-bound is A, a calcium deficiency, B, the birds are overweight, and C, they have a high-protein diet. So if the birds are eating too much protein, normally they're left on a starter feed too long. They eat too much protein, they become overweight, but that protein actually makes the egg white larger than it should be. So then, after the abnormally large egg white is produced, they have to make a shell to go around that egg white. So they're laying a really large egg. At the same time, that starter feed has made them a little bit overweight by the time they're 10, 12 weeks old, if you leave them on it that long.
Mm-hmm.
And the triple whammy is it doesn't have enough calcium, so the bird has difficulty laying the egg. So that's the most common reason, is those three things all playing hand in hand can make the bird become egg-bound when it's about 10 or 12 weeks old. So we always just recommend keep your quail a healthy weight, transition them over to a layer feed at the appropriate time before they start laying, so that they have the calcium they need and they have the lower protein in their diet to stay healthy and lay eggs for you. Some people are tempted to pump up the protein in their bird's diet so that they get bigger eggs. This works, but it puts your birds at risk. So the quail is going to lay the proper sized egg naturally when it's on the right diet, and you really don't want to push them too hard to lay bigger eggs.
Okay. All right, the next category we're going to talk about is breeding myths. And the first one is birds that breed true are inbred and unhealthy.
So this one's kind of carried over from the previous myth. We see this all the time. There's this concern that birds are inbred for whatever reason, and that's going to mean that they're unhealthy. So inbreeding is a dirty word with people and mammals. We don't want to do that as people. There's a slightly different dichotomy with quail, but there's multiple assumptions going on here. So one of the assumptions is that they're consistently inbred in order to have plumage that breeds true, like I said before. And there's so many ways to manipulate plumage if you understand the underlying genetics. It may involve inbreeding, it may not. But inbreeding is a tool that a lot of breeders use in a large toolbox of breeding tools. So the second assumption here is that inbred birds are unhealthy. This is also a myth. Inbreeding is a lot more common than some people think, especially in birds with a high inbreeding tolerance. But it's a double-edged sword, so it can be used to pull out good traits, but if you're not careful with it, it can also exacerbate bad traits. So it just depends on who's using it, if they know what they're doing, and whether they can do it responsibly. But yeah, typically professional breeders will use inbreeding to isolate and identify traits, either to perpetuate those traits or to remove bad traits. And then where you get the really bad results is if an inexperienced breeder inbreeds and isn't selective and then inbreeds again and again and again, you'll get inbreeding depression at some point. It's not very common, but it can happen, and that's not good at all for the birds.
Okay. The next one is, it's good to buy your females from one breeder and your males from a different one. Or to make sure that they aren't inbred. Sorry, I didn't see that.
Yeah. Yep. This is another. So people will go to great lengths to make sure that their birds are not inbred, and a lot of that comes from that misconception that inbreeding leads to birth defects, problems, unhealthy birds, and all kinds of problems in their genetics. So I guess to discuss this further, let's just define inbreeding as it pertains to quail and poultry. Usually when a scientist or a professional breeder talks about inbreeding, they're talking about direct sibling-to-sibling breeding. They're not talking about the broader term of father-daughter, father-granddaughter, cousin. There's different words like line breeding and line crossing for those types of breeding setups. So what we're talking about with inbreeding is direct sibling to sibling. It is the most risky type of breeding. It should be used with caution, but quail aren't mammals, so it's not necessarily a bad thing if the breeder knows what they're doing and they use it appropriately. But most breeders don't do it. Most breeders are colony breeding quail. They have a group of 20 to 50 quail. They're all in one pen, multiple males, lots of hens. They all select their mates. So the odds of having two birds come out of that are direct siblings is unbelievably low. I know when we pull eggs to sell in our jumbo browns, we typically have collection totes, and we pull from about 4 different breeding colonies for each tote. And I tell my packers, take two totes whenever you pack a flat of eggs, and pull half from each. So they're getting eggs from 8 different breeding groups, and the odds are very, very low there's a direct sibling in any of those breeding groups anyway. So if you order from one breeder, you're very rarely going to get 2 direct siblings. And we've already discussed the risks of crossing randomly. You can get the hybrid bigger, but then you can also get all kinds of unpredictable bad results. So it's usually good to keep all of your birds from one breeder, separate, isolated, and independent of your other birds until you really know what you're dealing with.
Okay. We already got that one. Next one is adding new blood occasionally will refresh my flock with healthy genetics.
We see this all the time. I think it's even used as a sales tactic to get people to come back over and over. You have to replace some of your birds every year or two, otherwise they're going to get too inbred. So we already talked a little bit about that. Direct inbreeding is actually kind of difficult. You almost have to do it on purpose to get 2 direct siblings. If you got them in a big colony, they're self-selecting their mates. And they're probably going to be fine.
Okay, hey Michael.
So we see a lot of people that are concerned about this.
Can you start that answer over with? You broke up real bad, and we missed more than half of it.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's no problem.
So adding new blood, we see this all the time. People that are concerned about their birds becoming too inbred, so they infuse new genetics on a regular basis, and it's actually really risky, especially if you don't know what you're infusing. So it's not really a good breeding practice. If you have an issue in your birds and you buy new birds to fix that issue, you could potentially be perpetuating the negative traits that you identified in your own flock. So there's different breeding tactics to improve your birds, but usually an outcross is kind of a last resort, and so we don't usually recommend it. It's not to say you shouldn't buy eggs from a good breeder. If you think you can improve your flock by switching to their genetics, that's often a good idea. But regular refreshing of a bloodline isn't really a good breeding program. So,
okay. This one I really have an interest in. Spiral breeding is the best breeding program. I want to let you answer that, and then I want to ask you a question about that.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we see this comment from well-intentioned breeders all the time. They want to make sure that they're not inbreeding their birds. They put them in a spiral breeding program. There's a lot of information on the internet about clan breeding or spiral breeding being the best breeding program for poultry. It just depends on where your birds are, your goals, what traits they have, how diverse their gene pool. But when we have customers ask us if they should spiral breed their quail, I usually ask them a few questions about their goals, where their birds are, and after I talk to them for a little bit, the answer is almost always no. Spiral breeding is a maintenance tool, and it's best used on a small gene pool of birds. So it's a breeding tool, but alone it's not really a good breeding program, especially if you have certain goals where you want to change certain things about your birds. So there's a toolbox of different things, like we mentioned outcrossing, line crossing, triple back cross. Spiral breeding would be one of those. Inbreeding would be one of those. There's so many different breeding tools, and you can use that in a strategy to get to a certain point. But it has a very unique place. It's very useful there, but it's not the end all be all. It shouldn't be your, especially if you just got birds and you're just getting into it. A lot of areas where you can focus before you're ready to spiral breed your birds.
Okay. Yeah, that you basically answered my question. Yeah, I've always heard if you're running a good spiral breeding program, introducing new blood totally messes up the spiral breeding program that you were working on.
Exactly. So the idea is if you selectively breed, and you really hone that bloodline to something very specific, then there is an appropriate time where spiral breeding has its place. But if you have a large gene pool, spiral breeding does nothing. It's just a distraction. So with a large gene pool of birds, there's really no benefit. And just for some perspective, I actually went out before this live and I counted how many different unique genetic strains or lines of quail we're running. With 84. Take a gander at how many of those we use a spiral breeding program. Just have a guess.
No idea. Zero?
2.
Really?
2.
Wow.
Yep. So of the 84 that we're working on, 2 of them are in a place where I think spiral breeding is the right answer for what we're currently doing with them. So the other 82, we're doing something else with them.
So is that to hone in on a specific color or variety or whatever you're working on, or?
No, not at all. So that all comes first, and then the spiral breeding is the maintenance tool. Gotcha. So when the gene pool is really small, and you want a little bit of diversity, so you can continue to selectively breed them, that's usually when spiral breeding is the optimal solution.
Okay, cool. Okay, guys, so I hope you enjoyed the show. I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank Michael Rose for taking the time to come on Coturnix Corner and setting the record straight on some of the common myths that are currently out there. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps me out. You can get notified of any new and upcoming videos. So thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one.